What's up, art students? So today we're going to help out Liam, one of my portfolio students, with a little bit of Photoshop help. He's been working on a portfolio piece where he's been sort of thinking about overlaying photography and looking at photography. I'll show you a couple of examples of his work in a moment. And I just want to kind of walk through this example of how he may overlay images in Photoshop using some selections and then using a couple of different blending methods. So to give you a sense of what sort of work he's been working on now, and then how he wants to kind of grow on it. He's got these really wonderful images that he's been able to take of his sister, and then sort of thinking about how he experiences his life, day-to-day life, through the sort of through the filter or through the lens of childhood images, or maybe even the lack of those childhood images, how we kind of imagine ourselves through those images. And so we've got an image like this, right, where he's doing some kind of digital double exposure, digital overlays and digital underlays, things like that. The conversation I had with him was, hey, look, you've already got these really beautiful photographs using sort of elements of the domestic space, something like a curtain, something like a window, something like the shelter of a house. Why don't we kind of play with more nuanced and more complex metaphors? Like, why can't we also reference these specific things like the curtain? Why can't we also reference specific things like the open window, and also keep a sort of semblance of, say, real space? And so how would we do something like carefully select out this curtain and then overlay and map other images behind it? This is sort of the work that I want him to kind of dabble in, and so this tutorial covers some of those basics. So what I'm going to do is take apart this image, kind of show you what's here, and then we'll just kind of walk through my version of the Photoshop edit, and then hopefully Liam will come to studio and show me some examples of his work. And so we'll start with maybe the rough image that came from his portfolio, something like this. Tons of potential here, right? Willing photo subject, really beautifully lit space, kind of really fun version of what might be playful, but what might also be somewhat of a serious sort of look at experiencing the world through sort of filters or opacities or layers, or almost like a Photoshop filter, right? Experiencing yourself through that filter, or maybe even seeing others through that filter. What I kind of talked to him about immediately was, well, we got to do some work with the exposure here, and so this curve up here is just an exposure curve. All I've done is sort of open up the exposure a bit. It's definitely not perfect. I think I would probably do a little bit more work on the sides of the image here, but at least now I can sort of see a bit more of what's going on. I was particularly interested in opening up what's happening here in the curtain, so that I can still pick up some details of, say, maybe her jawline, maybe her hair, definitely the sort of light catching the backside of her arm. I want to make sure that when I overlay multiple images into this, that I definitely don't lose what's going on in the original photograph, the detail in the original photograph. And then the other photograph that I've got added in here, let me just kind of disable the mask, is a photograph that he took as a separate assignment, different part of an assignment. Now I think he probably wants to use family photographs, but I sort of like the idea of overlaying sort of multiple versions of the same person, right? Like experiencing yourself in sort of multiple or complex ways. And so we have a separate photograph of the same individual. So underneath the curtain and on top of the curtain, same individual. And then I've used the layer mask to sort of carefully cut out along the curtain here and only include this second photograph in that specific curtain space. And this way the curtain behaves both physically as an object she's interacting with in the domestic space, but then also becomes this material through which the viewer encounters in this young woman, and the young woman actually presents herself to the viewer, right? In this way, family photographs operate both as an object in the home, but also a way in which I experience myself and present myself to the world. Kind of a complicated mishmash of metaphors here, but I think there's some serious potential in his portfolio, so that's why I think it's worth sort of piecing this apart and helping him out with the Photoshop work. So how do I do all this work? And maybe some of the most complicated parts of it, right, is, I mean, how might I get this really delicate selection here that is that is sort of the whole reason I can make this cell work, is just sort of getting this initial selection. So let's start from scratch. I'm going to pull open these images separately from the desktop, open them up in Photoshop, and we'll work it up from there. So I'll pull open the one that is going to be the stand-in for the family photograph here, and also this one here. So working in Photoshop, right now I've got each one of these photographs open up as its own tab. That doesn't really work right off the bat. I need to get both of these images into the same photograph, so I'll just kind of float this image down so that the tab is hovering here. Keyboard shortcut V to get to my move tool, drag and drop this image into the other. Lots of ways to put two images stacked into the same photo document. I just sort of like this one, seems to work for me. And I'm not going to get too concerned about perfectly aligning it, because right now the edges of the photograph are really not so important to me. In fact, I very likely will be doing some stretching and some manipulating of this photograph as this tutorial goes on. So not going to get too obsessed with sort of where this image is and how it's placed just yet. I'll turn that off in my layers palette and address maybe the first problem here of the image that's just a bit too dark. I kind of want to see what's going on, so I'll add a curves layer, bump up the curve, and I'm mostly focusing on the sort of curtain and facial expression here. I'm going to ignore the walls for the time being, so something in there seems to do the job. And now I'm going to get down to the task of getting a selection of this curtain. And it's going to involve, I think, probably a couple of different selection tools. The first tool I'm going to grab is the Quick Select tool. Keyboard shortcut for that is W. Now, Photoshop has thrown in a couple of new selection tools over the last handful of years. Quick Select is relatively new. Object Selection is fairly new. Object Selection probably won't work super well for this. I'm also not all that good at it yet, haven't messed with it. So I'm going to stick with my tried and true Quick Selection tool. But there's a lot of other ways that we can get Photoshop to recognize this sort of delicate edge of this curtain. So if Quick Select is not your cup of tea, don't worry about it. Now, it's probably also a good idea to be selected on the layer that you're selecting, and this is especially the case because I have multiple photographs in here. If I accidentally have the wrong photograph selected, but I'm still working with the Quick Select tool, it's just going to snap to the outer edges of this top image. Command D, deselect that, make sure I'm down here on the background layer, and then I'll just do my rough selection using the layer mask, and it probably is going to be selecting on the wrong things. I don't get too much here, too little. I'll hold Option to sort of push that selection line back, and then I can kind of work back into it to make that selection line bump back out. Option removes from the selection line, and then just sort of pushing these back in without Option selected expands that selection to where I need to be. Okay, so I'm not going to fuss too much about this corner up here. I don't intend on having a full 100% bleed photograph up near the hand. That's going to be faded in. But what I really want to do is be really careful and deliberate about getting this sort of tight area in here in the flowers, right? I want to do my best to get this selection really, really nice. So I'm going to do a little bit of a zoom in, get the edge of the curtain all the way down. And in this work, the more careful you do it, the smaller your brush work, this will pay off, right? It'll look a lot cleaner if you take your time and get a nice clean selection. But there are a couple things we can do that Photoshop has sort of built in to make selecting in here a little bit cleaner, a little bit easier, a little bit more automated. Once I've got a reasonably good quick selection, I'm going to come up to my options bar up here and click Select and Mask. Underneath Select and Mask, I sort of like to look at mine in the overlay mode. That's why you see this kind of totally in red. Below that, I am going to turn on Smart Radius and increase the radius so that I have a little bit of Photoshop assistance in finding right along the edges here. Now I'm also going to use this, what I used to call hairbrush. I think it's now called the Refine Edge Brush, and run that right along the edge of my selection. And at least initially, it may look like it's totally messing up my selection, but what it's doing is it's carefully finding and blending that edge. This is especially useful, say, for making selections around really delicate things like hair, right? That's why I call it the hairbrush. And what it's going to do is sort of help me snap a selection right along the edge of the flowers, but it's also fading the selection. And so I'm even going to do it down here in this relatively easy selection area, because it puts a sort of more naturalistic edge on my selection. It fades and tapers and sort of responds to the lighting of the photograph better. And so I'm going to run this hairbrush right along the outside of my entire selection. And this will help clean things up for me, so that when I bring the other photograph in and create a layer mask using this selection, it's going to be a whole lot less hand brushing. And so this is where I really like using selections and sort of some of the automated brush making tools. Is I'm just trying to avoid as much as possible a bunch of that hand brushing. Click OK here, and oh my goodness, look at this really messy edge to my selection. Don't worry, it's going to look a little bit brutal at first, but now I'm going to sort of take this selection and throw it into a layer mask, clicking this sort of circle in the box tool at the bottom of the layer mask palette, and that should give me a sort of really rough inclusion of the second photograph. So let's just take a look at that selection mask. So this was a really complicated selection right along the top curtain here, right? But because we used that hairbrush, to see how nice and delicate, and it even sort of responded to some of the light and dark areas in that curtain. I mean, that's a really nice kind of quick selection assist to make for some of the to make just some of that selection work easier. Some of the transparency work has already really happened. Now I am going to maybe do just a little bit of opacity work. I could say maybe blend this differently. I could use maybe a lighten. I could use maybe an overlay. And these blending modes are just going to sort of help me get that image laid in, especially since I want to start brushing this. An overlay might be a little strong, but now I'll actually take the opacity down just a little bit. And now I'm starting to get that feel, right? I'm starting to get the kind of presence of an image that is suggested, right? It's got the sort of lightness and nuance and care that is all present in the domestic space. And also, I would say, the kind of complex illusion, right? The sort of tricks we play on ourselves all the time, imagining that we, say, for example, that we are the same people as in our childhood photographs, or that we somehow can reenact those performances. I really like how the in his sort of concentration statement, in his work statement, it's sneaky, right? These other versions of ourselves sort of sneak up. We include them in our lives in ways that are not quite so obvious. And so I might kind of dip the opacity, right? I might even maybe desaturate some of the complex colors that are going on in these other ones. I'd also like to move this background photograph around a bit more and kind of almost position it in a spot where I might be able to line up the eyes, or I might be able to kind of riff on the sort of shape of her head. And so I'm going to unlink the photograph from its mask and use the move tool now, as long as I'm selected on this correct layer. And I can sort of shimmy the photograph around inside of the mask. That's sort of nice. I can also work with the scale still by zooming way out. Once I'm there, once I think I've got something that's relatively where I want it to be, I'm going to double click and accept that transformation, or I could click the little check mark up in the top bar here. Photoshop's going to think on that just a moment, and then I'll come back in to do a little bit more careful brush work. Once I've got this mask roughly in place, I'm going to grab my brush, keyboard shortcut B, maybe turn the opacity down just a little bit, and I can then work the edges of that mask so that maybe not all of the areas of the mask are quite so dense. Maybe the photograph isn't coming in quite so much here on top. I like to see the hand in the original photograph here. Or maybe softening right along here. I think some of these flowers got a little bit too harsh, and so I'd like to see more of the curtain right along the edges here. And so this is sort of where a bit more of the artistry is going to come in, and a bit more of that artistic preference, and also really dependent on what photograph is hiding behind here. That should definitely get Liam started. If you have questions for me, you can catch up with me in class, or zip me an email. I'm kind of excited to see what Liam comes up with, and if somebody else comes across the tutorial and you'd like to give this a try, go for it. I'd love for this idea of seeing yourself through your family photographs to even have legs beyond Liam's portfolio. I'll catch up with you in the studio, guys.